Have you ever wondered why religion exists everywhere across all cultures from ancient times right up to today? If it were only about people seeking answers to life, death, or the meaning of the universe, then religion should have stayed as something private, just a personal belief, a quiet search for comfort. But when you look back at history, another picture appears clearer, sharper, and far more unsettling. Religion was never just about belief. It was about power. Picture this: an ancient king with thousands of subjects. Sure, he could use whips armies and fear to keep control, but that kind of rule is exhausting, unstable, and costly. There's a smarter way. Instead of forcing people with swords, you convince them with stories. You tell them that the king was chosen by the gods, that obedience isn't just loyalty to a ruler, it's loyalty to heaven itself. Suddenly, submission feels like faith, and faith lasts longer than fear. That's when religion became the ultimate weapon. Not a weapon made of steel, but an idea that lives inside people's minds, shaping how they see themselves, their neighbors, and their leaders. It's no accident that rulers in Mesopotamia or Egypt weren't just political figures. They were divine. To resist them wasn't only rebellion, it was blasphemy. And this pattern repeats everywhere. In ancient China, emperors ruled by the mandate of heaven. In Rome, emperors were declared gods while still alive. Each time political power wavered, religion was there to stabilize it. No need for endless bloodshed, just a sacred story that made the existing order untouchable. So we have to ask, was this a natural development of human belief, or was it carefully engineered? The deeper you look, the more you see that behind every sacred doctrine stood someone who benefited from it. If you look at the earliest religious institutions, you'll notice something striking. They weren't open to everyone. They were run by a small, closed circle of priests, usually men who had access to rituals and sacred languages that ordinary people couldn't understand. That wasn't an accident. That was strategy. Think about it. If only the priest can read the sacred text, then only the priest can tell you what the gods really want. That creates dependence. Ordinary people had no choice but to turn to these religious leaders, not just for guidance and prayer, but for decisions about morality, justice, even life and death. And once that dependency was in place, authority and religion became inseparable. You can see this clearly in Rome. The emperor wasn't just a ruler, he eventually became a god himself. That transformation wasn't about faith, it was about control. If the emperor was divine, then questioning him wasn't just dangerous, it was a threat to the entire cosmic order. The same system existed in China, where the mandate of heaven declared that as long as an emperor ruled well, his power was legitimate. But if disaster struck, it meant the heavens had withdrawn their support. On the surface, it sounded like balance. In reality, it kept everything within the system, power always justified, always protected. And religion didn't just shape loyalty, it shaped law. Some of the first legal codes, Hammurabi's Code, the Ten Commandments, Islamic Sharia, gave moral weight to rules that were also about taxes, property inheritance, and control of land. These weren't neutral laws. They were designed to protect elites, often punishing the poor more harshly. They controlled women, defined status, and placed limits on speech and behavior. When you really think about it, religion gave a holy mass to systems of power. It wrapped politics in sacred language, making ordinary people believe that obedience wasn't just practical, it was sacred duty. That's not just belief. That's power dressed up as holiness. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, and the same pattern becomes even more obvious. The church wasn't just a spiritual institution, it was a political empire. Popes commanded armies, negotiated with kings, crowned emperors, and excommunicated anyone who stood in their way. This wasn't just about religion, it was raw power cloaked in holiness. Take the Crusades, for example. On the surface, they were holy wars to reclaim sacred lands. But when you look closer, it wasn't just about faith, it was about territory, trade routes, and dominance. Religion was the banner, but power was the prize. Even the Inquisition, which tortured people in the name of purity, wasn't about truth, it was about eliminating threats to authority. Heresy wasn't just a religious crime, it was political rebellion. And this strategy carried into colonization. When European powers set out to conquer the Americas, Asia, and Africa, they didn't always send soldiers first. They sent missionaries. Conversion became a weapon of control. Local gods were branded as false indigenous cultures as sinful. Churches were built directly on sacred sites, often by force. To be converted wasn't just about saving your soul, It was about breaking your identity, erasing your roots, and replacing them with loyalty to a foreign system. You weren't just baptized, you were subdued. This wasn't only about belief, it was about reshaping entire civilizations. Colonization wasn't simply military, it was spiritual warfare. And religion was often the first weapon drawn. And if you think this manipulation is ancient history, think again. Even today, political leaders wrap themselves in religious language to legitimize their power. Laws in many countries are still shaped by scripture. And when those laws are questioned, it's not just seen as dissent, it's branded as immoral. By tying authority to the divine, debate is shut down before it can even begin. If you pay attention to history, you'll notice how often religious leaders weren't just spiritual guides. They were landowners, politicians in robes, wealthy men living in palaces. They didn't just preach humility, they controlled wealth, property, and power. And when peasants starved, the answer they were given wasn't justice, it was prayer. When the poor asked why the rich kept getting richer, they were told that questioning the divine order was dangerous. This is where the real trick of religion shows itself. Followers are taught to obey not only God, but also those who claim to speak for God. That creates a chain of command. At the top, the divine. Right below, the leaders. And at the very bottom, everyone else. And if you challenge the leaders, you're told you're challenging God himself. That's not spirituality, that's manipulation. Now, some people will argue, but religion helps people. It gives them comfort, community, and meaning. And that's true, it can. But that doesn't erase how often it has also been used as a weapon. Just because something can bring comfort doesn't mean it hasn't also brought oppression. Systems are not judged only by their best outcomes, they're judged by their full history. And the history of religion is filled with violence, coercion, and suppression of thought. Reformers, philosophers, scientists, so many were silenced, punished, or even executed, not because they threatened divine truth, but because they threatened earthly power. The pattern is clear whenever ideas challenged authority, religion was used as the shield. What's most revealing is how religion often reacts to change, not with openness, but with fear. Not because truth is at risk, but because control is. And when belief systems are used to protect power, they stop being about truth altogether. They become barriers to thought. Look closely at the way religion shapes behavior, and one theme keeps returning: submission. Followers are told not to question, not to doubt, but to have faith. That message might sound spiritual, but it's also politically useful. If you're the one in charge, the last thing you want is a population full of critical thinkers. What you want is obedience. And religion provides that obedience by presenting it as sacred. God at the top, leaders right below him, and everyone else beneath. It's a hierarchy that protects itself. If someone challenges the order, they're not just rebels, they're sinners. That framing turns resistance into guilt. And guilt is powerful. Guilt keeps people quiet. Guilt keeps people small. Even the idea of the afterlife plays into this. If people can be convinced that their suffering today will be rewarded in heaven tomorrow, then they're far less likely to fight against injustice here and now. A poor farmer is told, "Be patient, you'll be rich in heaven." A person in pain is told it's just a test of faith. With that mindset, systems of inequality don't need to be fixed. They just need to be endured. Fear of eternal punishment is another tool. If disobedience risks not just earthly consequences, but eternal damnation, then the cost of rebellion feels unbearable. It's not just about law anymore, it's about your soul. That's psychological control at its deepest level. And even religions that claim to preach love often maintain strict hierarchies. Those hierarchies aren't built on kindness, they're built on silence, on obedience, on guilt. And that's no accident. That's design. Religion didn't just appear out of wonder. It was shaped, structured, and reinforced to serve those who stood to gain the most. When people finally began to read for themselves, when they started interpreting texts without a priest standing over their shoulder, the system grew nervous. Because once you remove the need for a gatekeeper, the gatekeepers lose their control. That's why religious texts weren't just preserved, they were edited, compiled, and censored. Books were left out, stories were rewritten, whole theologies were shaped not by divine revelation, but by councils of men who decided what was acceptable and what was dangerous. Look at how the Bible was assembled, how the Quran was compiled, or how Hindu scriptures were passed down through priestly castes. These weren't purely spiritual events. They were political acts. Decisions weren't just about what was true, but about what was useful, what could preserve order, what could protect power. And what happened to voices that offered a different message? Often they were silenced, branded as heretics, rebels, or apostates, not because their ideas lacked merit, but because they threatened the power structure. Over and over, those who called for equality for reason for reform were treated as enemies of faith when in reality, they were enemies of control. Even today, people argue that without religion, society would collapse. But the evidence suggests otherwise. Secular societies often have lower crime, higher education, greater gender equality, and stronger healthcare systems than deeply religious ones. That isn't a coincidence. When power is not concentrated in religious authority, there's more room for fairness, for progress, for compassion. This isn't an attack on spirituality itself. People will always search for meaning, for connection, for something beyond themselves. That's human. What we're talking about here is different: how that natural search was hijacked, reshaped, and turned into a system of control. Take a closer look at how guilt and shame are used. In many traditions, sin isn't just about self-reflection, it's a cycle of control. You sin, you confess, you obey. That loop keeps people small. It keeps their focus on personal purity instead of social justice. Instead of questioning unfair systems, they question themselves. Instead of resisting oppression, they carry guilt. And that serves the ones in power. Now consider the role of women. In most traditional religions, women are told to be silent, to serve, to submit. They're excluded from leadership, denied authority, and reduced to obedience. Is that divine wisdom, or is it patriarchy dressed in robes? When you examine the actual structures of these institutions, you see it clearly: the rules were written by men, for men to protect male authority. The same is true with caste systems, racial hierarchies, and divine kingship. These weren't mistakes or distortions. They reflected exactly who held the pen when the rules were being written. If your religion tells you that your suffering is your fault, or that the rich deserve their wealth, or that leaders must always be obeyed, it isn't offering wisdom. It's offering submission. And submission, when disguised as virtue, becomes a cage. Even today, governments fund religious institutions because they know it keeps people docile. Teach them that obedience is sacred. Teach them that forgiveness means accepting injustice. Teach them that patience in the face of oppression is holiness. That isn't morality. That's political strategy. And you can see it in laws. Rules about marriage, sexuality, education, even science. So many are shaped by ancient texts, not evidence or compassion. That doesn't move society forward, it holds it back. One of the most revealing differences between religion and other systems of thought is how they treat doubt. In science, doubt is encouraged, it's how discovery happens. In philosophy, doubt is essential, it's the foundation of inquiry. But in religion, doubt is often condemned. Why? Because doubt is dangerous to power. A person who doubts can't be controlled as easily. They ask questions, they challenge assumptions, they refuse to settle for fear-based answers. And when enough people start doubting, the whole system begins to crack. That's why even today, blasphemy is a crime in many parts of the world. Not because gods are offended, but because leaders are. Blasphemy laws don't protect divinity, they protect authority. And history is full of wars fought under the banner of religion. Crusades, jihads, massacres, inquisitions, all framed as holy battles. But at their core, these were fights over land, wealth, and influence. Religion gave them moral cover. It made conquest feel righteous. It made cruelty seem necessary. Time after time, religion followed power like a shadow. When slavery was profitable, religion justified it. When segregation and apartheid needed defense, religion blessed it. When women demanded rights, religion told them to wait. And when people began breaking free, religion suddenly clung to tradition and order. But whose order and whose tradition? Change is threatening not to truth, but to control. That's why those in power resist it so fiercely. If people stop believing, they must suffer quietly. If they stop accepting their place in society, the old structures start to shake. And those who sit at the top grow desperate. Even within religions themselves, the most radical voices usually came from below. Mystics, reformers, rebels, people who claim direct connection to the divine without needing approval from priests or institutions. And what happened to them? More often than not, they were exiled, silenced, or killed. Not because they lacked faith, but because they bypassed the hierarchy. They didn't just challenge doctrine, they challenged control. And that's the thread tying all of this together: control. Religion, as it became institutionalized and politicized, was never only about belief, it was about power. Who holds it, who keeps it, and who benefits when people remain silent. Some insist that religion is above politics. But history shows the opposite: religion has always been woven into politics, helping create hierarchies, justify conquests, and suppress rebellion. It told people their place and called it sacred. And when they stepped out of line, they weren't punished just in this life, but threatened with punishment in the next. That's not spirituality, that's a mechanism of control. So when we look at religion today, the real question isn't just, what do people believe? The deeper question is, who benefits from those beliefs? Who gains when obedience is treated as a virtue? Who gains when doubt is forbidden? Who gains when guilt replaces action and fear replaces thought? Belief itself isn't the danger. The danger is when belief has been shaped, edited, and weaponized by those in power, used not to free people, but to bind them. Think about how religious stories are told. The hero is often the one who obeys without hesitation. The villain, the one who questions or disobeys. That message, repeated over and over, doesn't just shape behavior, it shapes identity. It ties worth to compliance. It makes obedience feel like virtue and rebellion feel like guilt. And over time, that mindset doesn't stay in temples or churches. It seeps into homes, schools, communities, until it feels normal and visible. And the hardest chains to break are the ones you can't see. This is why so many people today still hesitate to question religious authority, even when it clashes with common sense or basic human decency. They've been told that doubt is weakness, that reason must bow to faith. That isn't coincidence, that's design. Religions that endure long enough to shape nations don't survive by accident, they survive because they became useful to those in power. They evolved to protect the system, not to liberate it. And in many parts of the world, questioning religion is still dangerous. People are jailed, harassed, even killed for asking the wrong questions. That's not about protecting truth. Truth doesn't need protection. Power does. Because at the end of the day, religion has helped powerful men shape the world, then called it sacred. They declared war and named it holy. They defended injustice and called it divine will. And every time someone resisted, they were told to wait, to pray, to obey. But here's the truth: you don't need a God to be good. You don't need a priest to tell you what's right. You don't need the fear of eternal punishment to care for others. Morality doesn't come from obedience. It comes from empathy, from reason, from shared human experience. So when you think about religion not as personal faith, but as an institution, ask who built it, who benefits from it, and who loses. Because the answers usually aren't the poor, the weak, or the outcast. They're the ones told to serve, to sacrifice, to stay silent. Religion wasn't crafted by gods. It was crafted by men, powerful men, who understood that the greatest form of control doesn't come from chains or armies. It comes from belief. And once you see that clearly, you realize you don't have to live inside someone else's system. You can choose to question, to think, to live freely. And that freedom, once you taste it, makes the old control fall apart.